General Motors plans to close its plant in Lordstown, Ohio.
General Motors temporarily shutting down more than half of its plants in North America.
This was not caused by a strike, it was not triggered by a parts shortage, and it wasn't the result of a sudden economic crash. General Motors shut down more than half of its North American production because it ran out of buyers. That single fact is what makes this moment so unsettling. For decades, General Motors represented stability, not just as an automaker, but as a pillar of the American economy. Its trucks were considered one of the safest bets in the industry, backed by loyal customers, predictable demand, and an entire financial ecosystem built around long-term vehicle loans. That system just broke, quietly and all at once. Nearly 900,000 unsold trucks are now sitting idle across dealer lots, overflow storage sites, and improvised holding areas. Each one is depreciating, each one is financed, and each one is quietly pushing pressure into places most consumers don't realize are connected to them: interest rates, trade-in values, lending standards, and future car prices. What makes this shutdown different is not its scale alone, but its cause. General Motors didn't misjudge a quarter. It misread an entire shift in consumer behavior, credit conditions, and economic tolerance. The company built trucks as if the old rules still applied: steady demand, affordable financing, and a buyer willing to stretch their budget. That buyer is disappearing. This is not just a General Motors story. It is a story about how modern industries fail, slowly at first, then suddenly, when data models lag behind reality. It is about how inventory becomes debt, how debt becomes risk, and how risk spreads outward until it touches people who never planned to buy a truck at all. By the end of this story, one thing becomes clear: the shutdown wasn't the crisis, it was the signal, and what it revealed has consequences far beyond factory gates or corporate balance sheets. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now onto the video. General Motors did not ease into this shutdown. It stopped production with an abruptness that sent shockwaves through the automotive industry almost overnight. Plants that had operated continuously for decades went quiet. Assembly lines that once ran on tightly choreographed schedules were halted not because of labor disputes or supply disruptions, but because the company had nowhere left to send the vehicles they were producing. The most symbolic closure came at the Lordstown, Ohio facility, a plant long associated with American manufacturing resilience, now standing as a visible marker of a deeper problem. The official explanation was framed in careful corporate language: inventory realignment, market recalibration, production optimization. But behind those phrases was a stark reality. General Motors had built far more trucks than the market could absorb, and continuing production would have worsened the damage. Every additional vehicle rolling off the line would have added financing costs, insurance liabilities, and depreciation to an already swollen balance sheet. In modern auto manufacturing, vehicles are rarely paid for up front. They are financed through a complex system of credit, where automakers, dealers, and lenders all share exposure. When inventory moves quickly, the system works. When vehicles stop selling, that system turns against itself. Interest accumulates daily, storage costs rise, capital gets trapped in metal that no longer generates revenue. That is what General Motors faced. Trucks that were supposed to represent profit instead became liabilities the moment they stalled. The decision to shut down production was not strategic, it was defensive. Executives were not trying to protect margins, they were trying to stop the bleeding. The speed of the shutdown revealed how little room for error remained. There was no buffer period, no gradual slowdown. The moment leadership accepted that demand had fundamentally weakened, the only viable option was to pull the emergency brake. In doing so, General Motors exposed just how fragile its operating assumptions had become. For an industry built on momentum, silence is never neutral. When assembly lines stop, the effects ripple outward immediately, into labor, logistics, financing, and confidence. And while the shutdown halted production, it did nothing to address the far larger problem already waiting outside the factory walls: a massive, immovable stockpile of unsold trucks. Once production stopped, the scale of General Motors' real crisis became impossible to ignore. Nearly 900,000 unsold trucks were already sitting across North America, parked in dealer lots, overflow yards, and makeshift storage locations never intended to hold vehicles long-term. What appeared at first glance to be a logistical inconvenience was, in reality, a financial trap tightening by the day. In the automotive industry, inventory is not neutral. Every unsold vehicle is typically financed through what's known as floor plan lending, a system where dealerships borrow money to hold cars on their lots, paying interest until each unit is sold. Under normal conditions, vehicles move quickly enough that the interest cost is manageable. But when sales stall, that clock keeps running. As General Motors trucks piled up, dealer lots reached capacity. Some refused additional deliveries altogether. Rail shipments slowed or stopped. Transport carriers were rerouted or left idle. To cope with the overflow, vehicles were stored in remote locations, former shopping centres, unused industrial land, and open airfields. These solutions were expensive, temporary, and inefficient, but unavoidable. The financial burden compounded rapidly. Each truck generated daily interest, insurance, and maintenance costs, while simultaneously losing value due to depreciation. Price cuts could move inventory, but at the expense of margins. Aggressive discounting also damaged resale values, which in turn weakened consumer confidence and trade-in equity. For General Motors, the inventory glut became a self-reinforcing problem. Lower resale values made buyers more cautious. Higher financing costs discouraged new purchases, and every unsold truck made the next one harder to sell. The company could not simply wait it out. Time itself had become the enemy. What made the situation especially dangerous was that the inventory problem did not exist in isolation. It exposed a deeper flaw, not in manufacturing capacity, but in the decision-making systems that had told General Motors this many trucks were needed in the first place. The question was no longer how to clear the lots. It was how such a miscalculation happened at all. General Motors did not build nearly 1 million unwanted trucks by chance. It built them because its internal forecasting systems said demand would continue. Those forecasts were rooted in years of historical data that had long favored full-size trucks. American buyers had consistently shown loyalty to pickups, often prioritizing size and power over efficiency. For decades, that pattern rewarded manufacturers who leaned into scale. General Motors trusted that pattern would hold, even as conditions changed around it. Interest rates climbed steadily, monthly payments rose, insurance costs increased, household budgets tightened. Yet production targets remained high, driven by algorithms trained on a past where buyers had more borrowing power and fewer financial constraints. The models assumed stability where volatility had already taken hold. Inside the company, sales figures began diverging from projections. Showroom traffic slowed, inventory turnover weakened, but production continued because the systems guiding output were slow to adjust. They favored long-term averages over real-time shifts. In effect, General Motors was building trucks based on yesterday's economy while operating in today's. Leadership trusted the data longer than they should have. By the time the mismatch became undeniable, the damage was already done. Factories had produced far more vehicles than the market could absorb, locking the company into a costly position with no quick exit. This failure was not technological, it was conceptual. Forecasting models can only reflect the assumptions built into them. In this case, those assumptions underestimated consumer sensitivity to debt, overestimated loyalty to large vehicles, and ignored early signs of behavioral change. The result was an illusion of demand, one that collapsed the moment reality intervened. Once executives accepted that the forecasts were wrong, the shutdown became inevitable. But correcting a forecasting error at this scale does not simply reset the system. It triggers consequences that move faster than leadership can respond. And the first people to feel that impact were not executives or investors. They were workers. When General Motors halted production, the effect on workers was immediate and deeply personal. Assembly lines that had operated on predictable schedules went silent with little warning. Shifts were cancelled. Overtime disappeared. Hours were reduced. For thousands of employees, income stability evaporated almost overnight. Unlike previous downturns driven by strikes or supply shortages, this shutdown offered no clear timeline. Workers were left uncertain whether the stoppage was temporary or the beginning of something more permanent. That uncertainty spread quickly through factory towns where automotive plants form the backbone of local economies. The emotional toll was significant. Families worried about mortgage payments and healthcare coverage. Younger workers questioned whether there was a future in an industry they had committed to. Local businesses, restaurants, service providers, and retailers braced for reduced spending as paychecks shrank. Management communications focused on stabilization and market adjustment, but those terms provided little comfort. Supervisors often had no concrete answers to offer. Even union representatives struggled to assess the situation, as this type of shutdown driven by excess rather than disruption was unusual. What made the moment particularly unsettling was the realization that productivity was not the issue. Workers had done their jobs, plants had met targets. The failure lay elsewhere, in strategic assumptions far removed from the factory floor. Yet the consequences landed squarely on the workforce. This human impact transformed the shutdown from a corporate problem into a social one. Communities that had supported General Motors for generations now faced economic strain through no fault of their own, and as workers absorbed the shock, another group found itself under mounting pressure: the dealerships and financial institutions that sat between manufacturers and consumers. While factories went quiet and workers absorbed the shock, the pressure shifted rapidly to a part of the industry most consumers rarely think about: dealerships. For many of them, General Motors' shutdown was not just disruptive, it was existential. Dealers do not own most of the vehicles sitting on their lots outright. They finance them through floor plan loans, paying interest on each unit until it is sold. Under healthy market conditions, vehicles move quickly enough that these costs remain manageable. But when demand slows and inventory piles up, interest accrues relentlessly, turning unsold vehicles into financial anchors. As GM's trucks stalled, dealers found themselves carrying more inventory than they could reasonably move. Monthly interest payments rose, cash flow tightened. In some cases, financing costs alone began consuming profits from other parts of the business. Dealers who had once focused on sales growth shifted into survival mode almost overnight. Rural dealerships were hit especially hard. Full-size trucks have historically sold well in these markets, and many dealers had stocked aggressively based on past demand. Now rows of high-priced vehicles sat untouched, while buyers hesitated, unwilling or unable to take on large loans at elevated interest rates. Some dealerships quietly reduced staff to offset financing costs. Others considered selling assets or exiting the business entirely. Cutting prices reduced margins and further weakened resale values, making trade-ins less attractive and eroding buyer confidence. The longer trucks sat unsold, the more toxic they became, not just financially, but psychologically. Customers sensed desperation, and hesitation grew. For the dealership network, the shutdown revealed a harsh truth: the system depends on constant motion. When inventory stops flowing, debt fills the void, and as dealers struggled to stay afloat, the financial markets began reassessing whether General Motors itself still represented a stable bet. The reaction from Wall Street was swift and unemotional. Investors did not interpret General Motors' shutdown as a temporary hiccup. They treated it as a warning signal, one that pointed to deeper structural problems. Analysts began revising outlooks, not just based on short-term earnings pressure, but on questions about forecasting reliability, inventory discipline, and long-term demand for high-margin trucks. In financial markets, confidence matters as much as numbers, and confidence eroded quickly. Institutional investors quietly repositioned their portfolios, shifting capital toward automakers with leaner inventories and more conservative production models. Credit agencies took notice as well, monitoring whether the shutdown would impact cash flow stability and borrowing costs. Even the possibility of a downgrade carries consequences, as it raises the cost of financing future projects and limits strategic flexibility. Bond markets reflected this uncertainty. Lenders priced risk mechanically, and the shutdown signaled increased volatility. For General Motors, this meant higher borrowing costs at a time when the company was already managing heavy capital commitments, including investments in electric vehicle platforms and battery supply chains. What unsettled analysts most was the lack of a clear endpoint. Inventory could be discounted, but demand could not be forced. If consumer hesitation persisted, the company faced prolonged pressure, not only on profits, but on credibility. Markets are forgiving of bad quarters. They are far less forgiving of broken assumptions. As Wall Street adjusted its stance, the shutdown took on a new dimension. It was no longer just a corporate or financial event. It became a political flashpoint, drawing attention from lawmakers eager to assign blame or extract leverage. General Motors' shutdown quickly migrated from financial headlines to political debate. Lawmakers seized on the moment, framing it as evidence of broader economic stress and policy failure. In regions dependent on auto manufacturing, the shutdown was portrayed as a betrayal of workers and communities that had supported the company for generations. Calls for hearings surfaced, public statements multiplied. Some politicians blamed high interest rates and macroeconomic instability, while others accused corporate leadership of mismanagement and overproduction. The shutdown became a talking point in larger arguments about industrial policy, domestic manufacturing, and economic priorities. Inside union halls, the mood shifted from anxiety to resolve. Labour leaders recognised that the shutdown had altered the balance of power. A company struggling with excess inventory and halted production was vulnerable, and workers understood it. Meetings grew crowded as members demanded accountability and protection against prolonged instability. Union strategists studied the situation carefully. They knew General Motors could not afford extended labour disruption while already under financial strain. Discussions turned toward leverage, how and when to apply pressure to ensure job security, clearer timelines, and stronger commitments before production resumed. The shutdown had reframed labour relations. What once felt like routine negotiations now carried existential weight. Workers were no longer just responding to a slowdown. They were confronting the possibility that the old rules governing their industry no longer applied. As political rhetoric intensified and labour tensions rose, the crisis expanded beyond America's borders. Global competitors were watching closely and preparing to move. Outside the United States, General Motors' shutdown was not viewed as a temporary stumble. It was interpreted as an opening. Automakers in Japan, South Korea, and China had been preparing for a shift like this for years. Many had already adjusted their strategies toward leaner inventory models, flexible production schedules, and vehicles better aligned with tightening consumer budgets. When General Motors halted production, those preparations turned into immediate advantage. Japanese manufacturers, particularly Toyota, continued emphasizing hybrids and fuel-efficient vehicles that appealed to cost-conscious buyers. Their disciplined approach to inventory management allowed them to avoid the kind of build-up now burdening their American rival. Production remained closely tied to real-time demand, reducing financial exposure and reinforcing investor confidence. Rather than competing head-to-head with large trucks, they leaned into segments that were still growing globally. This strategy resonated in markets where fuel costs, urban density, and household budgets mattered more than size or horsepower. Chinese automakers saw an even larger opportunity. Backed by aggressive pricing strategies and state-supported financing, they expanded rapidly into emerging markets across Southeast Asia, Latin America, and parts of Europe. While General Motors struggled to manage excess inventory, these competitors focused on speed, adaptability, and scale. The shift was subtle but meaningful. Market share did not collapse overnight, but it moved at the margins, and those margins compound over time. Once buyers switch brands or regions, diversify suppliers, regaining lost ground becomes far more difficult. General Motors' shutdown became a case study for global competitors. It demonstrated how quickly dominance can erode when production systems lose alignment with consumer reality. The message was clear: scale without flexibility is a liability. And in a global industry, increasingly shaped by efficiency and responsiveness, hesitation creates opportunity for others to lead. In the end, General Motors' shutdown was never just about trucks, factories, or one company's balance sheet. It was a warning signal, one that exposed how fragile modern industrial systems become when assumptions outlive reality. This crisis revealed the limits of debt-driven consumption. Rising interest rates, tighter credit, and shifting consumer priorities collided with production models built for a different era. When buyers pulled back, inventory turned into risk. When inventory stalled, financing tightened. And when financing tightened, the consequences spread outward, from workers and dealers to investors, suppliers, and policymakers. The shutdown also marked a turning point in how vehicles are bought and valued. For many consumers, large, long-term auto loans no longer feel safe or sustainable. Practicality is replacing prestige. Flexibility is overtaking tradition. These changes are not temporary reactions to economic stress. They reflect a deeper recalibration of expectations. For the auto industry, the lesson is stark. Success is no longer defined by how much can be built, but by how precisely production aligns with demand. Forecasting models must adapt faster, inventory discipline must tighten, and leadership must recognize that loyalty cannot override affordability. For communities and workers, the shutdown underscored how deeply intertwined manufacturing is with economic stability. When production halts, the impact is immediate and human. It reshapes livelihoods, local economies, and trust in institutions that once felt permanent. And for consumers, the message is unavoidable. The ground beneath the automotive market is shifting. The vehicles people drive, how they pay for them, and what they expect from ownership are all changing, quietly but decisively. General Motors' shutdown did not start this transformation. It revealed it, and the companies, governments, and individuals who adapt fastest will define what comes next in an industry entering one of its most consequential transitions in decades. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.